Hi everyone, I'm Logan Medish and this is High Caliber History. I recently had the opportunity to handle, photograph, take apart, and examine the original Thompson submachine guns from the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. It was an incredibly historic opportunity, and I thought I'd share the story of those guns and their history and their whereabouts with you today, because there's more to the story that you might not be aware of. So, without further ado, this is the story of the guns of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The 1929 St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago is one of the most well-known crimes of the 20th century. It has it all: Al Capone, Bugs Moran, illegal alcohol, a gang war, and, of course, Tommy guns. What's less known, however, is the story of how these guns, used in a crime in Chicago, Illinois, ended up in St. Joseph, Michigan, and how a fender bender led to their recovery and the downfall of one of the most wanted men in America. The massacre took place on February 14th, 1929, when a group of men from the South Side Gang were gathered in a garage owned by George Bugs Moran. The men were unloading a shipment of liquor when they were surprised by a group of local police. The officers ordered the men to line up against a brick wall, presumably to be searched, cuffed, stuffed into a car, and whisked away to the local police station for booking. Or, if they were lucky, these officers would be on the take and could be easily dispatched with some cash and, perhaps, a case of illegal hooch. Instead, the officers turned out to be imposters. They were members of Al Capone's North Side Gang, sent to take out Moran. These officers watched as two other well-dressed men entered the garage, produced an array of weapons, including 2 Thompson submachine guns, and killed the 7 men from Moran's gang as they stood against the wall. With the deed done, the guns were handed over to the police, and they escorted the well-dressed shooters outside to a waiting phony police car, acting as if they had just arrested the men inside. 6 of the victims died instantly, each man averaging more than a dozen bullet holes in them. But one victim, Frank Gusenberg, lingered for a few hours, despite having been hit a staggering 22 times. He was asked who shot him, and Frank was a loyal gangster to the end. He refused to give out any details. "No one shot me," he replied. Approximately 70 shots total were fired from the 2 Thompsons, and a couple shotgun blasts rounded out the carnage. A number of men were suspected of being involved in the crime. Despite numerous eyewitness accounts of what happened and rigorous questioning of some of the suspects, there wasn't sufficient evidence to bring anyone up on charges. Fred "Killer" Burke is one of the gangsters who was suspected of being a gunman in the garage. But just like the others, there wasn't enough evidence to try him for the crime. The case went cold until Burke slipped up later that year. On the evening of December 14th, 1929, Fred Burke was headed to the local train station in St. Joseph, Michigan to pick up his wife, Viola Dane. While en route, he was involved in a fender bender with Mr. Forrest Cool. Upon exiting their cars to examine the damage, Cool could smell alcohol on Burke, who said he'd compensate Cool for the necessary repairs. Burke produced a wallet full of large bills, far larger than the repair costs would have been, and so Cool agreed to follow him into town to one of the local merchants where the bill could be broken into a smaller denomination. While traveling to town, Burke took off and managed to lose Cool. Flustered, Mr. Cool got the attention of Patrolman Charles Skelly, a 25-year-old officer who had been on the job for just 7 months. Now, Charles's family Americanized their name to Skelly upon their arrival, so it's not uncommon to see both spellings or pronunciations. We'll use Skelly here. As Mr. Cool described the car and driver from the accident, Fred Burke just so happened to be driving through the intersection where the victim and the officer were conversing. Patrolman Skelly hopped on Cool's running boards, and they took off in pursuit of Burke. When they caught up with the drunk gangster, Skelly approached the car and told him that they needed to talk. At that time, Burke produced a Colt 1911 pistol and fired 3 shots, killing the young officer on the spot. Burke sped off, but he soon wrecked the car, fled on foot, and managed to escape capture. Exactly who had killed Skelly at the time was unknown, to the officers arriving at the scene. But a search of Fred's car turned up clues to the suspect's identity. Papers inside listed his name as Fred Dane, which was one of his many aliases, as well as the address of a bungalow in nearby Stevensville, Michigan. Officers showed up at the home just in time to see Burke's wife Viola arriving in a cab that she had hailed because Fred Burke failed to show up at the train station to pick her up. The officers found 2 Thompson submachine guns with 9 drum magazines, 3 stick magazines, 2 rifles, 1 sawed-off shotgun, some pistols and revolvers, more than 5,000 rounds of assorted ammunition for a variety of different firearms, tear gas bombs, 3 bulletproof vests, multiple disguises, and more than $390,000 in bonds stolen from a bank in Wisconsin, as well as some worn copies of various old detective novels. A fingerprint lifted from the house matched those on file for Burke, and the search was now on for one of the most wanted men in America. This is also a story of the birth of forensic ballistics. The Thompsons were turned over to Dr. Calvin Goddard in Chicago, where he was pioneering the fledgling field of forensic ballistics. Goddard was an Army officer and the head of the Bureau of Forensic Ballistics, which was the first independent crime lab in the United States. Goddard test-fired the guns taken from Burke's home in order to compare them to the bullets and spent cartridges recovered from the scene of the massacre. Using a microscope to examine the rifling markings on the bullets, the firing pin indentations on the primers, and markings on the cartridge cases from the extractors, Goddard was able to confirm that the Thompson submachine guns found in Burke's house were indeed the ones used in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre on February 14th, 1929. Now a little bit about the Tommy guns themselves. Thompson submachine gun model of 1921, serial number 2347, was produced by Colt's Patent Firearms Company and delivered to Auto Ordnance between July 18th and July 23rd, 1921. On November 12th, 1924, it was sold off to Deputy Sheriff Les Farmer of Marion, Illinois. Farmer soon left his career in law enforcement and became a member of the St. Louis-based gang known as Egan's Rats. Serial number 2347 eventually found its way into the hands of Fred Killer Burke sometime before the massacre. The other Tommy gun tested by Goddard was also made by Colt's Patent Firearms Company and was also delivered to Auto Ordnance, this time on January 30th or 31st, 1922, as a model of 1921A. The barrel was later modified with a cuts compensator, redesignated as the model of 1921AC, and was sold to Von Francis Sporting Goods in Chicago on October 19th, 1928. It was one of 3 Thompsons in the shipment, each accompanied by a drum magazine. Mr. Von Francis sold the gun to Mr. Frank V. Thompson, no relation to the gun's inventor, who had requested arrangements be made by Mr. Von Francis to have a local gunsmith by the name of Valentine Gooch remove the serial number, which was 7580, from all parts of the gun. Mr. Gooch's work added an additional $2 to the cost of the gun. Mr. Von Francis then packed the Tommy gun into a crate along with 4 bricks and mailed them from the sporting goods store to an address belonging to Victor Thompson in Elgin, Illinois. Victor then gave the gun to Frank on October 23, 1928. Serial number 7580 was then sold by Frank to Mr. Bozo Shoop of Chicago, who is believed to have been the man who put it into circulation with the gangsters before the massacre. Shoop was questioned by authorities in an effort to find out what had happened to the gun after he owned it. He refused to provide any information to the law enforcement officers and was soon found murdered in Chicago's West Side. Because Valentine Gooch, the gunsmith, had removed the serial number from the gun, Calvin Goddard had to find a way to recover any trace elements of it. To do this, he poured acid on the gun in order to raise the etching, traces of which were buried deeper in the gunmetal. Goddard's acid method worked. The model and serial number were indeed visible, albeit rather faint, when viewed at the right angle under ideal lighting conditions. Goddard's goal was to identify the gun by any means necessary. Preserving it for the future was not one of his goals, and so the acid he used ate away at the finish on the gun. Evidence of the acid-induced finish loss is still visible on the gun today. And now, the jig is up. Fred Burke moved to Missouri, assumed a new alias, married a woman named Bonnie Porter, and managed to steer clear of the law until March 26, 1931. A man from St. Joseph, Missouri, spotted Burke's picture in an issue of True Detective, which was a true crime magazine, and he recognized Burke as his neighbor, going by the name of Richard White. Authorities descended upon the residence of this Mr. Richard White and were able to surprise him while he was asleep. Upon waking, Burke briefly contemplated reaching for a revolver by his bed before realizing that his attempt was fruitless. Cornered in his bedroom by a group of bona fide law enforcement officers, he surrendered without a fight. 2 days later, on March 28, 1931, Burke was extradited from St. Joseph, Missouri to St. Joseph, Michigan, where he was held in the Barron County Jail before facing trial for the murder of Patrolman Skelly. On October 27, 1931, Burke pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. 9 years later, on July 10, 1940, he died of a massive heart attack at the age of 47. Burke went to his grave having never implicated anyone in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. He's buried at the Marquette State Penitentiary under his real name, Thomas A. Camp. There's still a lot of evidence about the massacre today. Moran's garage was torn down in 1967, but the back wall, the scene of the crime, still riddled with pockmarks from the massacre, was cataloged and sold to a man who initially intended to sell the bricks as souvenirs. That idea failed, so he then installed them in the men's room of a Vancouver nightclub with a 1920s theme and used it as a backdrop for the urinals, placing targets over the bullet holes. When that club closed, the wall was acquired by the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, where it is now on permanent display. Fred Burke's home in Stevensville, Michigan still stands. It's no longer a private residence, and it's now the home to a Coldwell Banker real estate office. The staff working there are well aware of the tie that the building has to the most infamous mob massacre. Much of the weapons cache that was recovered from the bungalow in Stevensville has long since disappeared, some of it falling victim to souvenir hunters, and other pieces of it falling victim to lax law enforcement security over the decades. However, the two Thompson submachine guns, serial numbers 2347 and 7580, are still held at the armory of the Berrien County Sheriff's Department in St. Joseph, Michigan. Believe it or not, the guns are still considered to be evidence in the 7 unsolved murders of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre on Thursday, February 14th, 1929. So there you have it. There's the history of the firearms used in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and the storied history surrounding them as to how they were found and how they still remain to be an active piece of evidence in America's longest unsolved crime. I hope you enjoyed. Have a wonderful day. Bye.